I met an old colleague for coffee last week, the kind of guy who seems to have won at modern life. He was practically glowing, visibly vibrating with a mix of caffeine and success. He spent the first 10 minutes showing me his smartwatch metrics. His sleep score was perfect, his meditation streak was unbroken, and he'd just secured a massive promotion. He leaned in and told me with absolute seriousness that he had finally hacked happiness. To him, it was just another algorithm he had optimized. He even quoted a bit of Marcus Aurelius about being an unshakable fortress. But then the waiter arrived and accidentally placed his order, a matcha latte, on the table without a coaster. That was it. That was the trigger. The transformation was instantaneous. The unshakable fortress crumbled over a wet ring on a wooden table. His face flushed red, his voice dropped an octave, and he snapped at the young server with a level of vitriol that was genuinely uncomfortable to watch. He spent the next 15 minutes ranting about incompetence and how this minor disruption had ruined his flow state for the afternoon. It was a jarring contradiction. Here was a man claiming to possess the ultimate secret to serenity, yet he was completely held hostage by the tiniest external friction. It made me realize that his excitement about his life wasn't joy, it was control. He hadn't found happiness, he had just built a very fragile cage and called it peace. And he isn't alone. We live in a society that has confused the appearance of a perfect life with the messy, gritty reality of actually living one.
Wow. That is such a perfect, almost painfully perfect illustration of where we are right now.
It really is, isn't it? It just stuck with me.
It highlights this huge gap between, optimizing all your external metrics, the sleep score, the promotion, the perfect routine, and actually cultivating genuine internal resilience.
Very unshakable fortress.
Exactly. His peace was completely dependent on everything outside of him being flawless. He built this fragile cage, and the second a coaster was misplaced, the whole thing just shattered.
And it wasn't just, a moment of anger. It felt deeper. It was like the illusion of his control was broken, and it revealed something really vulnerable underneath.
That's the core of it. And I think we all recognize that feeling, even if hopefully we don't act on it quite so dramatically. It's that feeling when the carefully constructed facade just instantly collapses.
Yeah, it proves that all the apps and algorithms in the world can't protect you from the fact that life is just messy. And that failure of external control to guarantee any kind of internal peace, that feels like the central struggle of our time.
It really is.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to really understand why modern life seems to be fostering this kind of emotional fragility, especially in younger people.
And then to look at what frameworks, both, ancient ones and modern ones, actually offer a robust, sustainable path to psychological resilience.
Right. We're going to start by digging into the influence of social media and hyperconnectivity, this whole engine of comparison.
Then we'll pivot to the bigger picture, the macro response. We'll look at how public policy is trying to shift towards what they call an economy of well-being.
And finally, we bring it back to the individual toolkit, how ancient philosophy like Stoicism and modern therapy offer a real framework for building that sustainable happiness that my colleague was missing.
Exactly. Let's get into it.
Okay, so we have to start where this crisis seems to be hitting the hardest, which is with young adults and their relationship with technology. But I think we need to make a really important distinction right away. Because the common complaint is just, oh, you spend too much time on your phone. It feels too simple.
It's way too simple. And it's an inaccurate way to frame the problem. We need to be much more specific. The research points not to screen time in general, but to something called problematic social media use, or PSMU.
PSMU.
Right. And it's a clinically defined psychological concept.
Yeah.
It's completely different from just, checking Instagram a lot or liking a bunch of photos.
So how do you draw that line? How do researchers tell the difference between someone who just uses social media a lot and someone for whom it's genuinely pathological?
The key differentiator isn't the clock. It's not about number of hours. It's about compulsive engagement, despite negative, clearly observable consequences.
Okay, so give me an example.
Well, you could spend, say, 2 hours a night scrolling through feeds and be totally fine. It doesn't interfere with your life. But if you only spend 30 minutes and that 30 minutes consistently causes you to lose sleep or miss deadlines at work or get into fights with your partner because you can't put your phone down,
then that's problematic, even if it's less time.
Exactly. The negative outcome, the pathology, is what defines it, not the raw quantity of time.
And the data really backs this up, right? The link to mental health issues is much stronger with PSMU.
Oh, absolutely. When you look at the studies on depression, The correlation between depression and PSMU is significantly stronger and more consistent than the link between depression and just the sheer amount of time spent on social media.
That's fascinating. So all the headlines about screen time are kind of missing the point.
They're missing the nuance. One key study found that the correlation between just checking your phone a lot and depression was small, almost insignificant.
Yeah.
But the correlation between PSMU and depression, that was moderate and highly significant.
That's a point that really needs to get out there. It changes the conversation from the device is bad to what is your relationship with the device?
Precisely. And what's more, some of the longitudinal analyses, the studies that follow people over a long period of time, they suggest that the causality might actually flow from PSMU to depression.
Wait, really? That feels backwards. I would assume that people who are already depressed or lonely would naturally spend more time online looking for connection. Depression causes the problematic use.
And that definitely happens. There's some bidirectionality there for sure. But the evidence that PSMU is a causal factor for depression is getting stronger, and it's rooted in the very design of these platforms.
How so?
Because once problematic use kicks in, it creates this toxic feedback loop. You're constantly seeking validation, while at the same time you're engaging in this incredibly destructive social comparison. That just compounds any negative self-view you have and can directly lead to, or at least worsen, depressive symptoms.
It's a machine that's almost designed to create misery.
In some ways, yes. And we're talking about a huge number of people being exposed to this machine.
Right, something like 90% of young adults, the digital natives, are on these platforms. So you have nearly an entire generation plugged into this harmful mechanism during their most psychologically vulnerable years.
Which means we have to talk about the engineering behind it all. This isn't happening by accident. This level of compulsive engagement is very skillfully engineered. The whole business model depends on it.
It's all about maximizing screen time for ad revenue.
Of course. And they use everything in their arsenal to do it. Predictive models, personalized banners, notifications, time for when you're most likely to look. Everything is targeted based on your past behavior to pull you back in.
They've even admitted that features like the like button and comments were intentionally designed to create what they call a social validation feedback loop.
And that loop gives you that little short-term dopamine hit from a notification, which keeps you tethered to the device. But the deeper, more damaging consequence is that this whole system is based on self-presentation. And that inevitably drives harmful comparison that just erodes your self-worth.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me, because the problem isn't just seeing other people, it's what you're seeing. It's an idealized, curated, often completely misleading version of everyone else's life. And it leads the average person into this cognitive trap of thinking, wow, everyone else is happier and living a better life than I am.
And this is where social comparison theory comes in. Psychologically, we make three kinds of comparisons. There's downward comparison, where you look at someone you see as worse off, and that can sometimes boost your self-esteem.
Okay.
Then there's lateral comparison, looking at an equal, which is pretty neutral. But social media incentivizes showing only your highlight reel, the perfect vacation photo, the big promotion, the filtered selfie.
So the comparison the platform encourages is almost always
Upward comparison. The target always seems superior, and that makes the person observing feel deficient, inadequate.
And we know this upward comparison is more destructive, especially for certain groups. The data shows that problematic social media use is significantly more common in females, right?
Yes, and that disparity is critical. Some researchers think it might be linked to a gender-specific vulnerability, to addictions that revolve around social interaction, and the intense pressure of self-presentation and social standing. For a lot of young women, social media becomes the main ruler for measuring their external value.
Is there specific evidence that shows it's the comparison aspect that's driving the problem for them?
There is. We can actually trace it in their behavior. One key study found that female participants showed a measurable preference for looking at and interacting with upward comparison images. Photos of attractive people with lots of likes, way more than male participants did.
Wow.
And crucially, they also scored much higher on something called the negative social media comparison scale.
Okay, what does that scale measure exactly?
It's designed specifically to quantify how negatively you compare your own life, your body, your accomplishments, your happiness, to the idealized, filtered stuff you see online.
And high scores on that scale are linked to low self-esteem.
Directly. Low self-esteem, body image issues, the works. It confirms that for many young women, The problematic use is centered on this destructive, compulsive need to measure themselves against an impossible standard. It's the feeling of inadequacy that's baked right into the platform's design.
So it's this toxic cycle. The PSMU leads to higher scores on this negative comparison scale, which in turn correlates with depression and low self-esteem.
And that brings us right back to the core psychological pathway. The connection between problematic use and depression isn't direct. It's mediated by these social comparison tendencies. The habit forces you to cross this bridge of comparison, and on the other side, you inevitably feel worse about yourself.
So the feedback loop is crystal clear. The problematic use makes you focus on people you perceive as superior, which causes negative self-comparison, which leads to depression.
And then, when you feel depressed, what do? You often go back to the device for distraction or a feeling of connection, which just drives more problematic use and keeps the cycle going.
And this individual struggle is happening against a really scary global backdrop. A recent UN study confirmed this, didn't it? That youth happiness is actually declining.
It's a huge deal. Life satisfaction and happiness have dropped significantly among young people, especially that 15 to 24 age group, over the last decade. It's particularly pronounced in developed Western economies.
It's so bad that it's forcing researchers to rethink the whole idea that your youth is supposed to be the happiest time of your life.
That whole optimistic assumption is being challenged. The data suggests young people are becoming more and more isolated. They're, and this is a quote, not going out as much, playing with their friends, interacting with others, or having as much sex.
So you have this intense physical isolation combined with constant, nonstop, upward digital comparison. That's a recipe for a mental health crisis.
It's the perfect storm. And given the sheer scale of this problem, it's a systemic, technology-driven crisis. It's pretty clear that just telling individuals to be more resilient isn't enough.
Right. You can't just tell someone to swim better when they're in a tsunami. We need systemic, large-scale policy changes.
Which brings us to the macro response. This is where we need to look at these big policy frameworks, specifically this idea of the economy of well-being, or EOWB.
This is a really fascinating shift. It's about moving beyond GDP as the only measure of a country's success.
Exactly. The EOWB framework, which has been formally adopted in European public policy, tries to put people and their genuine well-being at the absolute center of how policy gets designed.
It's an admission that pure economic numbers don't capture things like quality of life, mental health, social trust.
All the things we just saw are being eroded in young people. And it isn't just some fringe European idea. This is a global commitment. It aligns with the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
And big institutions are on board.
Oh yeah. The World Bank, the IMF, the World Health Organization, they all endorse this idea that investing in things like social protection, health, and education are actually crucial for economic stability.
So if you're a government trying to build this economy of well-being, where do you even start? What are the key areas you have to invest in?
The framework breaks it down into 4 main pillars, each designed to tackle the kind of systemic fragility we're seeing.
Let's start with the most obvious one, given our conversation so far, health and prevention. What does that look like in practice?
It's a complete overhaul. It means promoting good mental health through prevention, early diagnosis, and effective treatment. And just as importantly, it requires massive public campaigns to destigmatize mental disorders so people actually seek help.
So it's not just about building more hospitals.
No, it's about investing in health literacy so people understand their own mental and physical needs. It's about focusing on preventive care, like affordable prenatal services and early childhood education. It's a shift from crisis management to building lifelong health.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second pillar? It has to do with work.
Yes. Work and social trust. A well-being economy demands that work is a source of dignity, not just a paycheck. This means fair pay, good working conditions, and quality jobs.
Which includes preventing burnout and stress, not just physical injuries.
Absolutely. Creating respectful workplaces and actively preventing work-related illness is foundational. And when you do that, it's not just a cost. It leads directly to higher productivity and job satisfaction.
And this has to apply to the modern economy, too, like gig workers.
Critically important.
Yeah.
Policy has to extend social protections to new forms of work so that people in the gig economy don't end up in a state of financial fragility and social isolation.
So a healthy workplace is an investment in the entire economy. What's the third focus area?
Equity and inclusion. This is about basic social fairness. Policy has to aggressively promote gender equality, equal pay for equal work, reducing the gaps in employment and pensions.
It's also about helping people balance their lives, right?
Yes. facilitating the reconciliation of work, caregiving, and private life for everyone. Things like robust, equally shared parental leave are essential for this, and it goes beyond gender.
So all kinds of vulnerable groups.
Exactly. Ensuring the inclusion of people with disabilities, for example, in the labor market and in society. Actively fighting inequality and poverty isn't just a moral issue. It dramatically enhances the resilience and stability of the entire society. It builds the social trust you need for a healthy economy.
Okay, and the final pillar has to address this feeling of constant change and disruption.
That's resilience and adaptability. In a world being reshaped by digitalization and climate change, policies must promote comprehensive, lifelong learning and continuous skills development.
So people can navigate the challenges.
And seize the opportunities. Investing in education and training has huge social and economic benefits. It enhances not just economic stability, but also the psychological resilience of the population when they face a big shock, like losing a job in a dying industry.
You mentioned digitalization, which we know is a double-edged sword. How does this well-being framework handle technology in something like healthcare?
It's a huge challenge and a huge opportunity. AI and other data technologies could massively increase the cost effectiveness and quality of health services.
Yeah.
By streamlining admin tasks or improving diagnostics.
Because the risks are obvious. We're talking about incredibly sensitive health data.
Absolutely. So the policy has to be proactive. It has to ensure that any digital solution is secure by design. That means strict data protection rules, top-notch security, and ethical principles are baked in from the very beginning, not added as an afterthought.
And you have to make sure you don't leave people behind.
That's the other key part. Promoting digital inclusion is paramount. You can't have these technological advances creating a new divide that leaves older or less digitally literate people on the other side that would destroy trust in the system.
So how does a massive government entity actually do all this? It sounds incredibly complex trying to get the health ministry and the finance ministry to work together. They've always been in their own silos.
It requires deep, truly unprecedented cross-sectoral cooperation. It means that big economic policy coordination mechanisms have to integrate social, employment, education, and health policies horizontally. They can't be separate anymore.
So a finance minister making a decision about the budget has to consider the downstream impact on the population's mental health.
Precisely. They're explicitly invited to develop these cross-sectoral assessments to strengthen their decision-making. The goal is a balanced analysis that puts well-being at the absolute center of policy across the board. It's a mandate to fight these problems at an early preventive stage instead of just paying to clean up the mess later.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem, the social media environment, and the massive systemic policy solution. But now we have to bring it back to the individual, back to my colleague, the unshakable fortress who had all the external stuff figured out, but no internal resilience. We need the tools for that.
And this is where we find this remarkable, beautiful convergence between ancient philosophy and modern psychology. The most effective toolkit we have today for emotional regulation cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is deeply and explicitly rooted in ancient Stoic wisdom.
And it really is explicit. I know Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, literally cited the Stoics as a philosophical origin.
He did, and so did Albert Ellis, who developed REBT. He was heavily influenced by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. The lineage is direct.
So why do we tend to keep them separate? We think of CBT as this clinical thing and Stoicism as this, abstract philosophy.
I think historically it's because Beck and Ellis had to translate the philosophical ideas into a codified, measurable, secular clinical manual that could be used in therapy. But at their core, they share the same radical insight about where our emotional distress comes from.
And what is that core insight?
For the Stoics, destructive emotions, what they call pathe or passions, they didn't see them as these uncontrollable biological surges. They saw them as arising from errors in judgment, from false beliefs about what is truly good or bad.
So if you believe that having a good reputation is the most important thing in the world, you're setting yourself up for distress the moment someone criticizes you.
Exactly. And that is the exact cognitive model that laid the groundwork for CBT. CBT says that emotional distress comes from maladaptive thoughts and beliefs, cognitive distortions, and if you can examine and correct those judgments, you can relieve the distress.
So my colleague's judgment that a missing coaster was a catastrophe, that was the error. That was the source of his rage.
That was the error in judgment. The event itself was neutral. His reaction was a choice based on a false belief.
When people hear stoic, though, they often think of being emotionless, apathetic. But you're saying that's a misunderstanding.
It's the single most common and most damaging misconception. Stoicism is not about emotional suppression. The goal is apatheia, which doesn't mean apathy. It means freedom from irrational and excessive passions, freedom from those destructive passae.
So they're not trying to be robots. They're aiming for rational composure.
Precisely. And they even made a distinction. They recognized something called propatheiae. These are the initial, unavoidable physiological reactions.
Like what?
Like the jolt of fear when there's a loud noise, or blushing, or that first flash of irritation when something goes wrong. These are gut reactions that happen before your rational mind can even engage. Even their ideal Stoic sage would have these.
So the initial flush of anger my colleague felt when the waiter put the drink down, that first split second of irritation, that was the propatheia.
That was it. And that part wasn't the problem. The problem started the moment he endorsed that initial feeling with a voluntary judgment. This is an outrage. This is an insult. This has ruined my day.
He fed the fire instead of just letting the spark go out.
Exactly. And they also recognize eupatheiae, which are rational good feelings that come from correct judgment, things like rational joy or rational caution. They weren't against feeling. They were against being enslaved by irrational feelings. The whole training is about managing that crucial moment of judgment after the initial impression hits.
Which leads us to their most fundamental practice, the one everyone's heard of, the dichotomy of control.
This is the operational core of the entire system. Epictetus taught that the very first step to a tranquil mind is to clearly, ruthlessly distinguish between what is within your control and what is not.
Okay, let's define those two buckets because this is the essential practice. What's in our control?
The very short list. What is in our direct control are our judgments, our volitions, so our choices and intentions, and our actions that come from those choices. That's it. It's all internal.
And what's not in our control?
Pretty much everything else. Everything external. Our bodies, our possessions, our reputation, the actions of other people, the outcomes of our efforts, the past, and whether or not a waiter remembers to bring a coaster.
So the whole point is to direct all your mental energy toward your internal choices and to cultivate acceptance for everything else. But what about things you can influence but not totally control, like your health or your kids' behavior?
That's a great question, and it's where the nuance comes in. For those things, the Stoic approach is to internalize your goals. You can't control the outcome of being healthy, but you can control the effort, eating well, exercising. You can't control your child's behavior, but you can control your effort to be a virtuous, patient, loving parent.
You control the quality of your input, not the success of the output.
And if the result is imperfect, but you acted with virtue, your tranquility is preserved because you did the only thing that was ever truly up to you.
So let's look at some of their specific techniques, which are just uncannily similar to modern therapy. The first one, negative visualization or premeditatio malorum.
Right, the premeditation of evils. This is the practice of contemplating feared scenarios. Losing your job, getting sick, even your own death, which to a modern person sounds like a recipe for anxiety.
It really does. Why would you want to sit around thinking about terrible things happening?
The intention is psychological inoculation. It's like a vaccine. By mentally rehearsing these potential losses and thinking about how you would cope, you reduce the emotional shock if they ever actually happen.
And it makes you more grateful for what you have now.
That's the other huge benefit. It dramatically increases your gratitude for your current situation. It shifts your perspective from entitlement to appreciation, which is an incredibly powerful form of resilience. It's very similar to what modern therapy calls stress inoculation training.
Okay, what about another one? Cognitive distancing and reappraisal.
This is about separating your subjective emotional interpretation from the objective facts of a situation. The goal is to see your troubling thoughts as just mental events or hypotheses, not as objective reality.
To see the story you're telling yourself about the event.
Yes, and to describe the event in purely non-evaluative language. This is the absolute essence of what CBT calls cognitive restructuring, where you challenge cognitive biases like magnification, making a mountain out of a molehill.
And then there's anger. They had very specific techniques for anger, which seems to be the emotion of our age.
They called anger a temporary madness. They believed it arises from the judgment that you have been unfairly harmed. The remedy is twofold. First, delay.
Wait.
Yes. Seneca's advice was, the greatest remedy for anger is delay. That pause allows the initial physiological arousal, the propatheia, to cool down so that your rational mind can actually engage.
And then once you've paused, you do the reappraisal.
Exactly. You remind yourself, it is my opinion about this event, not the event itself, that is causing my anger? In a workplace, for example, instead of fuming about a colleague's incompetence, you apply the dichotomy of control. You focus your energy on performing your own duties virtuously and accepting the limitations of others that you cannot change.
Demanding that the world be perfect just guarantees you'll always be frustrated.
Always. Focusing on your own virtuous response is the only path to equanimity.
This entire framework feels so robust. How effective is this approach when it's put into practice as CBT in modern clinics?
It's incredibly effective. CBT is the recommended first-line treatment for the vast majority of psychological disorders in children and adolescents, things like aggression and conduct disorder. For adults, it's highly effective for depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, eating disorders, substance abuse. The list goes on. It's a proven, evidence-based toolkit used all over the world.
And what's so interesting is that CBT is now becoming more accessible through technology, which brings us back to where we started.
It really does. Beyond traditional therapy, we now have computerized CBT, or CCBT. These digital programs have been proven effective in randomized controlled trials for anxiety and depression.
So you don't necessarily need to be in a room with a therapist.
Not always. Some research suggests CCBT can be just as effective as face-to-face therapy for things like adolescent anxiety, and it's often much more scalable and cost-effective.
And now we're even seeing AI get involved.
Yes, mobile apps and AI-powered chatbots are being developed to deliver CBT concepts. The promise is contextual, always available support that can scale globally. It's about early intervention and building resilience. But, of course, ensuring clinical quality and data security are still huge challenges.
And for people who don't want a high-tech solution, the principles can be taught in simpler ways, too.
Absolutely. It can be delivered effectively in group settings, like moral recognition therapy for inmates, or stress inoculation training for general stress. Even guided self-help books can be effective. The fundamental strength of the approach targeting that core judgment works regardless of how it's delivered.
So we started with this image of a man whose perfectly optimized life shattered because of a wet coffee ring.
Yeah.
And whether we look at his individual failure or the systemic crisis of youth happiness driven by social media, or even the massive policy solution of an economy of well-being, the core task is always the same. It's about figuring out where genuine, non-fragile control actually comes from.
The evidence, from ancient philosophy to modern policy, all points to the same conclusion. Trying to hack happiness by controlling the external world is doomed to fail. The world is just inherently messy and beyond our will.
So fragile happiness is built on control.
And robust resilience is built on judgment and acceptance.
It seems like we need a dual approach. At the societal level, frameworks like the economy of well-being have to shift how we measure success. We have to prioritize mental health and social trust, seeing them as the bedrock of a stable society.
And then at the personal level, each of us has to use these internal tools to challenge the cognitive distortions we face every day, especially the ones created by comparing our messy reality to someone else's perfect filtered projection.
It's a war fought against our own false judgments. Whether that judgment is telling you a missing coaster has ruined your life, or that everyone on Instagram is happier than you are.
The link between Stoicism and CBT isn't just a fun historical fact. It's the most proven, evidence-based toolkit we have for getting at the root cause of our distress, which is the false belief that external things determine our peace.
It really all comes back to that.
The enduring lesson from 2,000 years of thinking about this is that the greatest leverage point for human tranquility isn't in trying to control the inevitable chaos of life. It lies in relentlessly training our own internal reason to correctly assign value only to what we can control. The unshakable excellence of our own character, our judgments, and our choices. That relentless training of our own mind is the only true, unshakable fortress we will ever have.